Man takes a picture of his wife on fishing trip. What he captures is more than just a fish. This couple's enjoying their fishing trip, not knowing that would all change soon. When the man took a picture of his wife, he captured the moment his wife caught a fish, unaware it was more than just a fish. Because when they arrived back home, something happened they both couldn't have expected. Frank and his wife, Laura, are enjoying a nice vacation. They both adore fishing, so they took a fishing trip to relax while spending time together doing their favorite activity. However, they weren't aware that this trip would change their lives, which all started when Laura caught a big fish. This one is strong. Laura grunted while trying to reel the fish in that bit. Frank came to support her, and together they managed to haul it into the boat. Good catch, Lau. You, Frank said before kissing her, they decided it was the perfect fish for the barbecue, not knowing the impact of that choice. After being satisfied with their fishing, the couple decided to return to their vacation home. Frank opened the cooler and took the fish Laura caught with him. "Let's get you ready," he said with a smile. Frank loved fishing and preparing freshly caught fish, but he was in for a surprise this time. He scrubbed the sails and took the fins off after carefully making an incision across the belly of the fish. Usually, it was muscle memory for him, but this time, something was different. Instead of the knife subtly sliding through the skin, it got caught on something inside. "What is that?" Frank mumbled. He repeated the motion to make sure he wasn't mistaken. Yes, there it was again. Frank felt the knife vibrate in his hand as it hit something. He went in with his hand feeling something hard and pulling it out. His eyes grew wide when he saw it was a key. In full excitement, Frank yelled for his wife to come over. He walked toward the sink to clean the key of all the fish's insides. All the slime and dirt were now washed off the key, revealing a layer of rust. When his wife walked into the kitchen, he showed it to her. Laura stared at it with a confused look on her face and asked him what was going on. "It's a key," he stated. "It was inside the fish." They stood in the kitchen in silence for a moment, after which Laura asked how it could have gotten there, not knowing how important that was. "What a funny find," Laura said while taking the key out of Frank's hand. When she put it on the counter, she asked when they would eat, returning Frank's mind to the order of the day. Moments later, they were eating and eventually went to bed, but Frank's thoughts kept returning to the key. It kept him awake, so he grunted frustratingly and got out of bed.
Okay.
He whispered while rubbing his hands together. He opened his laptop and went online to try and find out something about the key. And when he hit search for the first time, the results surprised him. The first page of results was filled with documentaries about old legends or research articles on different types of keys throughout history. After skimming through the results, there wasn't anything about this particular key. So he decided to go back to bed, not knowing what the next day had in store for him. His alarm went off early the following day, and he kissed his wife good morning before making breakfast. Frank tried to convince Laura to help him research the key. It would be a nice change of scenery, he used as an argument, so not much later, they went toward the town. It was a small town, and the center consisted of a small square with a few shops, a supermarket, a town hall, and a small library, which was where they were headed. After spending an hour looking through books, Laura sighed. "Let's go." A little disappointed, they left the library, and then Frank saw it. On the corner of a side street, he noticed a sign that read pawn shop. "Maybe someone there could help us," he said to Laura as he pointed toward the shop. His wife shrugged, saying it would be at least more fun than the library, so they went inside not knowing what to expect. A bell signaled, they entered the store, and a bald gray man greeted them heartily and asked if he could help them. Laura went off to look at the things in the shop as Frank approached the owner. "I have this key and hope you can tell us something about it," he said. "Oh, let's see," the owner said enthusiastically, causing Laura to join her husband. "It sure is nice," the owner continued, but he confessed he couldn't tell them anything. However, before Frank and Laura could feel disappointed, he told them he knew an expert. Eager to learn more, they agreed to let him come over. "This is Harold. He is a historian here in town, and I frequently use his advice in the shop," the owner said after the expert arrived. Frank handed the key over to Harold, explaining they found it while fishing. Frank noticed Harold's face light up for a moment. Weird, he thought. Everyone watched in silence how Harold examined the key. Frank anticipated it was something incredible based on the short reaction he noticed while handing over the key, but that wasn't the case. "I'm sorry," the expert said with a hazy voice. "It's just an ordinary rusty key, but that couldn't be, could it?" Frank thought. "Well, you heard him. The shop owner said it turned out it was just an ordinary key, so it was useless to him," which meant his interest was gone. "Thank you, Harold," he said when the expert left. But then something peculiar happened because when the expert walked by Frank, he passed him a note. Frank couldn't wait to know what was in the note, so he tried to hurry his wife outside the store. Once outside, she demanded to know what he was doing, but she fell silent once she saw the note. What is that? She asked. Frank's eyes grew as he read the message. It's an invitation. Curious about why the expert invited them to his house, the couple decided to go. You sure? Frank asked Laura, and she nodded. The door swung open almost immediately after Frank knocked. The expert invited them in, and they entered hesitantly, not knowing their minds were about to be blown away. Come on in. Sit down, Harold said while gesturing to some chairs. The couple couldn't help but notice his sudden change in mood. The expert spoke in a clear and energetic voice while pacing the room. Let me see the key again. Harold asked, flabbergasted. Frank handed the key over. Frank felt he was reliving the past as he and his wife watched how Harold examined the key. Only this time it wasn't silent. No, this time the expert kept muttering enthusiastically. Frank felt Laura's hand on his leg and saw confusion on her face when he looked at her. What was going on? I'm sorry, but why did you invite us? Frank asked. It was as if Harold was waiting for that question as he started rambling. The couple tried to understand him, but he talked so fast that they only caught some of it. Something about an old legend and a ship. What about it? Frank asked. Harold sighed deeply, realizing they didn't understand him. This key is from the 16th century and was made in Portugal, he said. Frank and Laura stared at each other, silently unsure what Harold was discussing. It's from the same place and time as the Sao Pedro, Harold exclaimed as if that would clarify everything. He noticed that it still didn't ring a bell for the couple. The sunken Portuguese vessel, the legend of Sao Pedro and its lost treasure. Harold said as he explained he thought the key belonged to it. Now Frank and Laura started to understand. A lost treasure. They repeated in harmony. Was this really happening? Laura hugged her husband in excitement while Frank's mind was racing. What did this mean? They shouldn't rush to conclusions, so he asked the expert how they could know for sure. Not expecting the answer. We don't, at least not until we find the Sao Pedro. He said, find it, Frank repeated. Harold began to pace around the room again as he explained that this was the first real lead anyone had ever gotten that proved the Sao Pedro legend was real. The expert tried to convince them to act on this lead and find the legendary ship. This is an incredible chance, he yelled. Frank and Laura looked at each other. Frank began this search wanting to know more about the key, and now he knew more. Another opportunity arose. I mean, if you're in, he said softly to his wife, Laura wouldn't let this chance go by. Where do we start? She asked. They discussed their options. There are some rumored locations of where the wreck might be, Harold said, but there only seemed one logical option as a starting point, the place where they caught the fish, so they left the house, not knowing where their search would lead them to next. On their way to the boat, they passed a diving shop, which got them thinking, wouldn't it be good to get some gear? Frank asked. This was their chance to get it, so they got some scuba gear and underwater cameras to be safe, not knowing how important that decision would be. They arrived at the boat, where Laura and Harold stored all the newly purchased gear in the container while Frank checked the GPS. Yes, it's still here, he exclaimed when he saw the location where they caught the fish was still registered in the navigation. Let's go, he said while putting the throttle down. When Laura caught the fish, they were deep in the ocean, so it took a while before they arrived back at the spot. Here it is, Frank eventually said. The mood on the boat suddenly felt tense. Were they about to discover something incredible? They got their gear ready and entered the water. They didn't have their own scuba gear because they were only beginners. Nonetheless, they did their best to scour the ocean, but nothing indicated a shipwreck. That's a bummer. Harold said when they returned on the boat, they could all feel each other's disappointment, but then Frank suddenly thought of something. We caught the fish here, but that doesn't mean the key got dot inside it here, he mumbled. Laura and Harold looked at him confused as they didn't hear what he said. Frank told them the shipwreck wasn't here as he explained to them what he had just thought. But where was it then? They thought about it in silence when Harold suddenly dashed toward the computer. Frank and Laura watched him fumble his hands over the keyboard and his eyes darting across the screen. Got it? He yelled while clapping his hands. The couple made their way over and were surprised to see what was on the screen. In front of them was a map of some sort, and Frank asked what it was exactly. A wide smile appeared on Harold's face, a fish migration map. With this map, they could backtrack the fish's movement. Incredible thinking, Harold. Laura said this would take them to the right place, but then they realized they compared the migration map with the map on the boat's navigation system, and their hope sank deep into the ocean. This is way out of our reach, Frank said out loud what every one of them was thinking. How would they be able to search such a big part of the ocean? What are our options? Laura asked them, not ready to give up. She was happy to hear both men agree with her. They discussed their next step and decided to return to shore where they would make their treasure hunt known. They were going to contact the authorities, not knowing what would happen. None of them knew what to expect when they called the authorities and told them their findings. It's our best shot. Just do it. Laura talked them up confidently. Now that Frank had to explain their story to someone, he realized how ridiculous it must sound. Not sure what would happen, he called. And then Harold and Laura watched with anticipation how Frank's call ended. And Laura asked the million-dollar question. It took a while for Frank to find his words. Eventually, he told them officials were on their way, meaning they had to stay put. Laura looked confused. Does that mean they will help? They would find out soon. When they were told to stay put, they weren't told how long it would take for someone to show up. Eventually, when dusk started to fall, a black CUV stopped near them. A woman got out and approached them. "I'm Professor Harkis. You called," she said. "My unit is ready to get started." Then they didn't understand what she meant. So Frank asked her, "I've been tasked to retrieve the remains of the Sao Pedro," Professor Harkis explained. Frank, Laura, and Harold were overjoyed, but didn't have much time to celebrate as Harkis wanted to start searching. Not much later, they were on their way with newfound hope. The ship of Professor Harkis was much bigger than theirs and was overflowing with the equipment. While following the course of the migration map, they scanned the ocean floor, mapping everything that was down there. It took them days to reach the halfway point, and they didn't find anything. But then, after 4 days of hearing the waves crash into the ship, another sound was heard. A loud ping echoed over the deck. The scanner found something. Come on, Frank shouted at Laura and Harold, who were slower than he wanted. Could this be the moment they worked so hard for? Professor Harkis was already at the instrument. "Come take a look. It will show up any minute now," she said. Slowly but surely, a vague image appeared on the monitor showing a prominent structure on the ocean floor. "Send down the drone," Harkis ordered while Frank, Laura, and Harold stared at the monitor. When the drone entered the water, the monitor's picture changed to the drone's view. Everyone held their breath, and Frank kept Laura close to him. "This is it," he whispered in her ear. Then something appeared in the drone's view. There was a moment of silence before everyone on the ship erupted. Clearly coming into view was a wreck. It was the Sao Pedro. "We did it!" Frank cheered while embracing Laura and Harold. They were jumping up and down the deck celebrating the incredible find. Harkis congratulated and thanked them as they couldn't have done it without them. Now the salvaging could begin. It took a few months before the salvaging was complete, but the finding was headline news the same day they found the ship. Frank, Laura, and Harold were all contacted consistently by different media stations or newspapers. It took some time to get used to, and one call in particular made their day. Shortly after the salvaging was complete, Frank got called by the National Museum. The museum director wanted them to formally open the new exposition of the Sao Pedro. "We would love that," Frank replied enthusiastically. And with Laura and Harold, he was the first to look at the restored Sao Pedro.